This is week 6, audio 3. So I'm looking at slide 16 now. And I don't want to go through every one of these in detail because what I want you to come out of here is more the information that was on those high-level slides showing general trends. I don't think it's useful really to try to give you, to try to make you absorb this month-by-month, blow-by-blow sort of thing, but I am going to talk about it very briefly in general. So if you look at slide 16, you can see the thing that was mentioned before. Yao Wen-yuan, who later became a member of the Gang of Four, so-called, published his attack against Wu Han, the playwright, who was the vice mayor of Beijing, directly reporting to the real target, who was the mayor Peng Zhen, because he had resisted many of Mao's measures in the Beijing government and had stopped publication in local Beijing newspapers of news about Mao. So after that attack was made and everybody was all nervous, Mao took a trip around different parts of the country by train in order to talk with local party leaders and try to make sure that they were on his side, and probably he spent a lot of time talking with the military too. And he pushed for the initiation of a cultural revolution. And here, it's interesting, he went away. It's not like he didn't stay in Beijing to try to snap the whip, crack the whip, and make everybody toe the line and start this cultural revolution. Instead, he issued instructions for it to happen, and he left one person in the Politburo to supervise this, named Kang Sheng, who was mentioned before, and then off he goes. And it was a very interesting strategy because I believe what he was trying to do was, again, give his targets enough rope to hang themselves with. He goes off, Mao's not around, while the cat's away, the mice will play. These guys don't do everything they're supposed to do, and Mao, of course, is getting reports all this time. And he's able to, with more authority perhaps, to order the purges that begin that spring, and which begin to move into high gear when he comes back in May, and he has a student leader named Nie Yuanzi. Yuanzi is a synonym for atom. Yuanzi Dan means atom bomb. Dan is bomb. So Yuanzi Dan, Nie Yuanzi. Do this big character poster. And Mao allows Liu Shaoqi to go ahead and dispatch work teams to the universities in Beijing to try to bring the student movement under control so it doesn't start to harm the interests of the party. So then going on to slide 17, Mao lets that go on for a month, and he's got something there to hang Liu Shaoqi with, trying to sabotage his cultural revolution, and he has these work teams withdrawn, and then all hell breaks loose. Mao posts his own big character poster, calling on the masses to bombard the headquarters, meaning his enemies in the Politburo and the Central Committee. He asked for the formation of Red Guard units, and the masses jumped to it. One of the big questions that Meisner poses in the readings is he says that it's interesting to consider why Mao started the Cultural Revolution, but it's even more interesting to consider why people in the general public went along with it. And I think that part of the answer is that the general public held Mao in the same high esteem as did the leadership. And part of the answer is that there had been many inequalities in society that had developed that we've already discussed. And part of the answer was that no one wanted to blame Chairman Mao for the famine. This isn't discussed very much. The famine is usually ignored when people talk about causes of the Cultural Revolution, but I suspect that the suffering that had gone on just a few years before was not yet forgotten by people, including in the cities. People developed anemia, which is a symptom of starvation. They had gone through not having anything but a little bit of rice every week, or wheat every week. There were no fresh vegetables, blah, blah, blah. I don't want to get into it. And the suffering had been tremendous. And people didn't forget about that. There was no general amnesia, but people didn't want to blame Chairman Mao for it. So another thing that was very unpopular was the way the regime had kept detailed records on people, in the cities anyway, and they would keep them in the countryside if the need was felt. But it was the cities where the party was really trying to control people because, for one, they wanted to keep the peasants out of the cities and control the level of population. They didn't want third world slums in the cities. And so one of the tools in keeping people under control was to maintain this urban personnel file system, or Dang'an. Dang'an is a Chinese name, a Chinese word that simply means file. That's all it means. It's not. It doesn't carry some evil meaning like some writers like to say. But in Shanghai, because the government there was relatively leftist, it was one reason, I guess, and another reason was that there was some amount of dissension there. I think based partly on the city's revolutionary history. This had been, after all, where the Communist Party started out, and they started there because there was a proletariat, there was a workers' base there. It had the biggest population in China of workers. So the conditions there for dissent were more favorable than in other places. It wasn't Beijing, which was under close political supervision. It was China's biggest city, and it was far away from Beijing. So there may have been, although I don't know if anybody has shown this yet, there may have been a more repressive urban surveillance system in Shanghai than in other places. And people were really able to grab onto this issue of there being black files, which must mean 黑色档案. 黑色 was used as a sort of a synonym for politically condemned. White meant Kuomintang, meant the KMT. Red meant the Communist Party. Black meant black element. There's another phrase, black hand. The black hand behind the June 4th disturbance, counter-revolutionary rebellion, that sort of thing. But anyway, in Shanghai, this struggle began, which occurred at the same time as these big Red Guard assemblies, rallies were happening in Tiananmen Square, and they began to move toward, Mao began to move them toward the direct criticism of Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping, his two colleagues on the Politburo Standing Committee, who were the main competent managers of the party and the government, respectively. So there were these 8 mass rallies where the loyalty of the masses to Mao Zedong personally was demonstrated. which gave him, I think, more encouragement to condemn his enemies, and that's what he did. He made his enemies begin to disappear in the last few months of 1966. In the meantime, there was this really bizarre story, slide 18, of the Shanghai Commune, which is based on in the minds of some, on the Paris Commune. You can look this up on the web and get the full story quite easily. The Wikipedia page is decent on this, the Paris Commune. And there's also a decent Wikipedia page on the Shanghai Commune, but it's also in the readings. It's also in the Meisner book. There are several pages devoted to this. And I don't want to go over it in detail. I guess I just said that, didn't I? And I went on and on. But the bottom line with the leadership there, with the Shanghai Commune in the last part of 1966 and into early 1967 was that it produced a new radical leader, this man Wang Hongwen, who became a favorite of Mao until he proved that he was not worth a darn as a central leader. He didn't have the smarts, he didn't have the ability to work hard, long hours that would be required for somebody in a central leadership position. He disappointed Mao after a couple of years, but in the beginning, he was a radical leader in Shanghai who caught the eye of the central leadership. By this time, there was the Cultural Revolution group that was taking over a lot of the propaganda and organization functions from the party center as those officials were being purged. The Cultural Revolution group was headed by Jiang Qing, Mao's wife, and included these other two members of the Gang of Four that I've already mentioned, one that was mentioned for the first time here, Zhang Chunqiao, and Yao Wenyuan, who wrote that critique of the Wuhan play, or the Wuhan Peking opera. So they attempted, the people on the left, to overthrow the Shanghai municipal government, and they pretty much succeeded. To make a long story short, but the problem was that as soon as they succeeded, then other militant groups around the country began to try to do the same thing. They began to approach army units, ask for arms. They began to take over individual government buildings, overthrow leaders, put them in jail, try to take over the municipal government, and so on. And as the Cultural Revolution group became aware of this, and they made reports about it to Mao, Mao basically, at a very, not getting into any detail, he changed his mind about the whole thing and decided that allowing Shanghai to create a commune, a worker-run, completely democratic, no representatives, just popular vote decisions type of government in the city would create chaos, not only in Shanghai, but it would create chaos all over the country. Now, one thing about Mao was that he was very practical. He always looked at a situation and asked himself, and this is in his writings, what are the objective conditions? Are the objective conditions favorable to a victory? In other words, do I have enough soldiers? Do I have enough forces? Are the people mostly on my side in order for me to win an armed struggle against an enemy? And Mao was not one for suicidal tendencies. He was not one to, I think a Black Panther Party leader in the United States in 1968 called it Custerism, as in George Armstrong Custer, who lost the Battle of Wounded Knee against the Sioux Indians. Custerism. Mao was not in favor of Custerism. Mao was in favor of measuring the objective conditions. And I think he must have measured the objective conditions in the rest of the country. And since he had just gotten off tour from going around the country, he probably had a good idea, and because he also had his spies everywhere, he probably had a good idea of how many big cities had the same strong militant leftist movements as did Shanghai. And if what happened next was any guide to the objective conditions, he probably decided that Shanghai is Shanghai, but other cities are other cities, and the left is not as strong in other places like Guangzhou, like Tianjin, like Shenyang, Chengdu, Chongqing, and so forth, as it is in Shanghai. So he decided that the Shanghai Commune should come to an end, and it should be replaced by a revolutionary committee made up of the Triple Alliance of party, army, and Red Guard organizations. And the important thing to remember about this is that this Triple Alliance that made up these revolutionary committees became the semi-permanent form of government for a long time, until Mao's death. Revolutionary committees in the big cities and in the rural counties all over the country became the normal form of government, even when Mao had the army mostly withdraw from local leadership. There were still some army people left in the revolutionary committees that ruled the localities. Let's go on to slide 19. So in the rest of the country, there were stalemates that developed. I think that Mao at first decided to see what would happen, but it wasn't long before he was calling on the military to begin to restore order. First, though, there was this brief period in 1967 where he allowed the Cultural Revolution group, Jiang Qing, Zhang Chunqiao, Yao Wenyuan, and then the new boy in the group, Wang Hongwen, to push for seizure of power by proletarian revolutionaries, and by that they meant the militant leftist groups. So the order went out for these revolutionary committees to be established around China in the middle part of the year, but it didn't happen very quickly. And the problem that developed, this is where the Cultural Revolution got out of control. The problem developed that localities were supposed to do one thing, but there were too many newly established interests between people who were now enemies of each other, and this situation became very complicated, and I certainly can't explain it in detail, because the problem with trying to assess the overall situation in China during this time is that it was not a purely ideological divide that tore apart these different places. Quite often, the divide between different groups was not only ideological, left and right, conservative and militant, it was also personal. It was also factional, based on personalities, based on leaders who didn't like each other. And each of them tried to be more red and more students of Mao thought than the other. And it became very confusing. There's been a lot of writing on it, and quite frankly, it makes the whole situation seem chaotic and nonsensical. Speaking of chaotic and nonsensical, let's go on to slide 20. So there were all sorts of things happening, not only in the remote areas, but also in Beijing. A radical faction took over the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in April. That same month, there had been fighting between a radical faction inside the the CIA of the time, the Central Investigations Department. And there was a threat of, by one side, of taking the files that were very secret and exposing them. And what was happening during this time is very interesting, and you can find a lot of this stuff in flea markets if you wander around the flea markets of Beijing and Shanghai nowadays. There were these Cultural Revolution Red Guard handbills and newspapers that published secrets that had been taken from ministries. Usually they were aimed at denouncing some official or another, but foreign ministry secrets began to leak out and get into these Red Guard publications, and Zhou Enlai was very concerned that the same thing might happen at the Central Investigations Department, and so he got Mao's approval in the middle of April to have it taken over by the military. In Hong Kong, there were riots led by people from the Xinhua news agency, which was the de facto embassy or consulate in Hong Kong for the Chinese Communists. And a number of them, the leaders, were arrested. This caused the arrest of a British journalist in Beijing. And there's a very good book about that written by the journalist named Anthony Gray called Hostage in Peking. Gray is G-R-E-Y, Anthony Gray. And during this time also, the foreign ministry was still under the control of a leftist named Yao Dongshan. This is in your readings. He had been the ambassador in Indonesia and had fought off the Indonesian mobs that tried to take over the Chinese embassy. It wasn't just the Chinese doing this foreign embassy invasion stuff. And so late in the month of August, Red Guards entered the British mission and made everybody come out and made everybody kowtow, bang their heads on the dirt and all that stuff. And of course, there were teams of people on the standby to go in and ransack the place and look for as many secrets as they could get out of there. That didn't end up in Red Guard newspapers. But anyway, never mind. And so the next very serious incident that occurred, slide 21, occurred in Wuhan. And this was the incident that pretty much convinced Mao and the rest of the leadership, including the Cultural Revolution group, that if things weren't brought into control, there would be civil war. To make a long story short, there was this military commander here that Wuhan was the capital of the military region. Each military region is named after the major city that's in it, and it included 3 provinces. So this man, Chen Zhaidao, sided with the conservative party faction instead of with the militant leftist faction. He was ordered to support the militants by Beijing, by the Cultural Revolution group. He refused to do so. A set of army divisions was sent down to make him do it after he took some people from Beijing, including the Minister of Public Security, Xie Fuzhi, hostage after they came down to talk with him. The man who came with Xie, named Wang Li, was beaten severely. Beijing got pissed. They sent an airborne unit and 3 infantry divisions to surround the city, and it would have been an all-out war between PLA units had Chen not decided to surrender. But bizarrely, a year later, General Chen is a hero. Why is he a hero a year later? Because in the intervening time, Mao Zedong, as I mentioned before, has changed his mind about backing leftist radicals all over the country. He comes down on the side of stability. He comes down on the side of the PLA, and he gives orders to the PLA to restore order. So it's a bit of a seesaw, kind of Dow Jonesy, if you will, roller coaster sort of thing, but that's the way it happened. Mao wanted to make this revolution He thought he could use students and young people to do it. He followed through and indeed allowed them to wreak havoc all over society, but then he discovered that they were not controllable, particularly outside of the capital and particularly outside of Shanghai. And so he made the pragmatic decision to rein them in and use the army to knock heads together where necessary. So yesterday's revisionists suddenly became today's saviors and guardians of stability. We'll stop recording 3 here and finish up starting on slide 22.